Hi, everyone who's joining. We're just giving a couple of minutes for people to join. Thanks for coming. But I think everybody's in. So I think we're gonna get started. Anyway, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Dany Bahar from Brown University and the Center for Global Development, and we're excited to start this spring series of the policy implications of recent globalization research, together with all the organizers who are here in the panel, from the German Development Agency, CEPR, and Center for Economic Performance of LSE, and the Center for Global Development, a lot of centers. And I'm thrilled to have Laura Alfaro opening this up. So I'm going to introduce her very quickly because she doesn't need a lot of introduction, but as you probably know, she is the Warren Alpert Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School and an affiliate at CEPR, and as well as many other affiliations. And she was my PhD advisor, I should add. She's an outstanding academic. She's also an outstanding, proven record as a policymaker, because she was the Minister of National Planning of Costa Rica, of her native Costa Rica, between 2010 and 2012. And she's the author of multiple articles in leading journals. She's a renowned expert on topics such as international capital flows, foreign direct investment, sovereign debt, trade, emerging markets, and alike. And her topic today is very timely. She will talk about the title of her talk is "Can Information Shift Preferences Towards Trade Policy? Evidence from Randomized Survey Experiments." Welcome, Laura. We're looking forward to your talk. Thanks for being here with us.
Thanks, Dany. It's great to see a lot of great friends. Hopefully it would be live. I did hear when you said spring, considering that in Massachusetts is like minus 15 centigrades. I was like, yeah, sure, spring. Spring in Massachusetts. Anyways, so this is joint work with Maggie Chen and David Chor. Here, I don't think I need a lot of introduction, but do you see my slides? Hello?
Yes, we see them.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Thanks. And so let me start with some general motivation. As I said, in this group is not as needed, but as we know, there has been this general anti-globalization sentiment that has been rising in many, many countries, fueled by a series of political events and actors. Think Brexit in UK, Trump in the US. But again, there has been a generalized anti-globalization sentiment, and then COVID struck. Already there was some rethinking about global value chain strategies, but it reinforced the thoughts that there should be some, again, nearshoring, getting out of separate countries, bringing back to domestic countries. And indeed, many governments have enacted unilateral actions that have tried to reduce dependence to international global value chains, try to bring some production home. What is interesting is that we all know that the underlying conditions for perhaps some of this backlash against globalization are there in the mid-2000s. One could argue even earlier. The decline in manufacturing, weak labor markets, rising inequality are not a recent event. In fact, if you think about it, we could go even back to the 80s. To some of these trends. And in fact, if you grew up in the 80s listening to some of the music by Bon Jovi and some of these Bruce Springsteen, a lot of the songs were about that. The loss of jobs, the complicated life, living on a prayer was precisely about that. So it is interesting that it's lately that political actors have been very successful in voicing some of these concerns. There has been a rise of platforms that have been anchored on anti-migration, anti-trade. On top of that, the world has been exposed to this trade shock that has again, reinforced this COVID shock that has reformed some of these views, in a world where people are getting information quick, fast, and in general, not based on research. And so that is what we're trying to do in this paper with co-authors, David and Maggie. We want to know if the information the public is exposed online influences their views on trade policy and by how much. But in particular, what we want to know is if people change their attitudes towards globalization when they're exposed to research-based information treatments. So we're going to provide participants, or we have been providing in a series of surveys, randomized research-based information. If you want facts about globalization, we have been conducting these surveys in some tests since 2017. I'm going to present results for 4 rounds of surveys that we've been conducted every year since 2018. And so we have, as in the standard randomized research methods, we have a pure control. Then we have our treatments that, as mentioned, are going to be research-based narratives on the relationship between trade openness and labor markets, related to what we simply call trade hurts, trade helps, or trade helps prices, and I'll go into more detail. Then we ask participants to express their views on different economic policies. And because of the timing which we've been running these surveys, we actually also ask them about how COVID and the Black Lives Movement changed their views on globalization. And so to give you a little bit more details, the trade hurts jobs is based on research from Author, Don, and Hansen. Input competition from China has weakened manufacturing employment and low-skilled wages in the US. We expose them to trade helps jobs based on the work by Lorenzo Caliendo and co-authors, where we tell them that service jobs have actually outstripped losses in manufacturing because cheaper imports from abroad have allowed the US to become more cost competitive. And then we also tell them trade helps prices, and we show them evidence of nominal lower prices in durables and apparel. We also change this treatment. We also mentioned that tariffs hurt prices, and we show them evidence from the recent Trump tariffs. As I mentioned, we have been running this survey now for 4 years, more than 15,000 participants. We started doing it in 2017 in MTurk. We then moved, and this is the results that I'm going to present, to a stratified sample that we commissioned to Qualtrics. These samples are close to 12,500 participants. We ask participants after they're exposed to the different treatments, their policy preferences in a simple yes, no. And we find that most of the participants, just as a summary of findings, when asked yes, no, they tend to express that they're against trade. As I said, close to 50, 60%. However, when we ask them to rank their views, we give them, again, different policies, and we ask them which are your preferred policies. We only get 20 to 30% of the folks to say more limits on imports is their preferred policy. Most participants rank education, work training, a higher minimum wage, higher taxes as their top preferred policies, 50 to 70%. When we expose participants to the trade hurts, we consistently, all the rounds that we have done this survey, we do get them to shift their policies to be more protectionist. So the narratives trade hurts do move participants to prefer more limits on imports. The treatments, however, are not symmetric. When we tell them trade helps jobs, we don't get participants to move in favor of trade. What is perhaps more puzzling, every time we mention trade lowers prices, we actually got folks to be more protectionists. And again, stressing gains from jobs related to trade didn't make participants more pro-trade. anything we mentioned about trade helps prices was moving also participants to be more protectionist. We also find that in general, attention matters. Our results are driven by folks who understood the treatment. We asked them later a simple validation for them to see if they at least recall the treatment. Our puzzling results, if you want, are not driven by folks not per se understanding that the treatment was about jobs or prices, but we do find that the longer people take in the survey, they would move more towards some expectation of how we thought the treatment would affect participants. So again, attention matters, and perhaps staying a little bit longer with the facts also matters. We also do find that these broad shocks, COVID, Black Lives movement, did seem to people were spending on a policy, perhaps logically, they had more important things to do and did seem to affect how much they were engaged with the treatments we were providing. When looking at mechanisms, we tend to find that trade hurts seems to reinforce some prior beliefs or positions in the left-right-wing spectrum. We follow up and ask participants for them to explain to us why they were choosing protection, and the most recurrent rationales were concerns about China and jobs, which we thought was interesting, again, related to the fact that this is research-based information. When we tell them China, it does seem to trigger some underlying concerns. Trade exposure variables in general, we tend to find insignificant effects. And so again, this does seem to suggest that it's just hard to persuade participants that trade helps. It might be, as we mentioned, some prior position that makes salient some concerns about the labor markets. The trade hurts, again, does seem to have a lot of traction. So it's not that our treatments are not getting effect. We do get effects from trade hurts, but we just don't get symmetric results, which do tend to speak about how the difficulty of conveying to the population research in fast, quick manner, especially if it's against some prior conceptions. However, when we do spend more, again, we do find people will react the way we're expecting. And when we do trade hurts, but then we explain trade helps, we do seem to mute some of the negative effects on protectionism. Of course, there are caveats. There is the question of the external validity. We are doing this research on internet-based surveys. However, we argue that increasingly, this is the way people are getting information, internet and quick. We also, there's the question of persistent effects. As I mentioned, one of the earliest rounds we did at MTurk, we follow up on those participants and we had some evidence of persistence. Again, it's following up 2 months later, which is not a long time in the big scheme of things. There are always concerns in MTurk, but at least that gave us some confidence that the results might be somewhat persistent. In terms of the literature, there is a very broad literature. Apologies if we're not citing your paper. Some of the traditional papers that have looked at this issue have used as the national world surveys, the World Value Survey or the American National Elections. This is work by Bluniging, Slaughter, and Dany Roderick. And again, there's always the concern that there might be some underlying unobserved characteristics, but this existing work has shed light on some of the correlates with these policy preferences. There has been this recent movement of randomized information, and there is also a growing number of work in immigration, in taxes and redistribution, but also in trades and tariffs. 3 papers in particular are very close to our work, Detail and Roderick, Stefania's work, and Rodriguez and co-authors. We argue that a difference is that existing work is providing hypothetical cases. We are giving research-based information and in a brief, concise manner. Some of the other work are engaging people and explaining hypothetical cases through longer periods of time. And so let me give you more details about the survey design. Then I'm going to show you the findings and some concluding remarks. So as I mentioned, the survey, the objective is for it to be user-friendly and short. So we mounted it in Qualtrics, and we were aiming for participants to be able to answer these questions in 5-10 minutes. So that was one of the constraints when designing the survey. We wanted people to do this relatively quickly. The first part of the survey asks background information, gender, age, race, the country of birth, state of residence, education level, employment status, and household income. We then move and ask them background, beliefs, and positions. We ask participants to self-place themselves as liberal or conservative on an economic point of view, but we also ask them to tell us which candidate they supported in the last 2 elections. By now, we have had 2 national elections, and so we collected that information. We also asked beliefs about the situation, the perceived situation in the US related to, do they think income inequality is a problem? We asked them about their satisfaction with the job. We also asked them if they thought their kids would have a better life. We also asked questions about whether they thought NAFTA had been good for their family or not, to get a benchmark on trade views. We also asked them trust questions. Do you trust the government, foreign firms, private sector? We also asked questions related to their willingness to buy a foreign brand. And also we had proxies of loss aversion, with a series of questions that asked them for how much they were willing to sell or buy an object they already had. We also asked them information of where they get their news, TV, newspapers, internet, and the frequency. In the second part, we asked the different treatments. As I said, we had that trade hurts jobs, trade helps jobs. We had, when we combined this information, first telling them trade is good for jobs, is bad for jobs, and then we switched the order. We also had that trade helps prices. In particular, this one included a couple of variants. We were worried at some moment that perhaps people were associating cheaper with bad quality. And so we changed the word cheaper for availability of goods. And we also run this without the word China. And we also explicitly told them that trade hurts prices. These narratives were all based on research. Again, we were not transmitting hypothetical cases, and no fake news, if you want. So let me just show you more detail. So this is the trade hurts jobs. As I mentioned, this is based on the research of Autumn, Dorn, and Hansen. The way we prepared the survey is we combined the survey with a little explanation, and we also gave them a graph. Some people are better with written explanations. Some people are better reading graphs. So we told them that a line of research has shown that imports from China after it joined the WTO has been a major force behind the fall in the US employment, as the figure shows below. And this has led to weak wage growth for the middle and low income workers who used to hold these jobs. We did not tell them that this is by Otto, Dunn, and Hansen. Again, we didn't want the particular identity of the authors, perhaps to bias the views, but to convey that this is research-based, we did include footnotes in the different graphs. Again, to convey that this is research-based information. The next one is based on Caliendo and co-authors. Again, the same initial line that the WTO, China has joined the WTO, but we showed them that this has led to an increase In jobs, that is more than what has lost anywhere. And again, we mentioned the correlation with the imports from China. For trade helps prices, we showed them actual cases of prices that have gone down in nominal terms. We didn't want to confuse people with real and nominal, so we showed them the price of durables, computers, electrical, and furniture that have been in nominal terms going down. As I mentioned, we worried that perhaps some of our wording was being taken as low quality. So we replaced availability of cheaper goods for increased availability of goods. And then in another one, we also just took out the name China. And the last treatment is we explicitly told them that tariff hurts prices. And here we're drawing of recent research that has shown that the Trump tariffs have led to an increase in prices. So after we expose participants to the different information treatments, we asked their views on different policy preferences. And we started with simple yes/no questions. Do you support limits on imports? Do you support more tariffs? Again, it might be that people don't know what a tariff is. They may relate more to just limits on imports. They may be actually very knowledgeable and know the differences between these two. In any case, we ask both. Then we ask them in which industries. We then ask them for alternative policies. If you support a minimum wage, we also run a little horse race. Do you prefer higher taxes or higher tariffs, both or neither? And we ask them their views on free trade agreements. We then asked them also to rank the preferences. And so we gave them 8 options: taxes, minimum wage, unemployment benefits, more education, limits on imports, exchange rate manipulation, exiting free trade agreements, or more limits on migration. And we asked them to rank these different policies. As Dany Roderick has noticed, a tariff may be just an alternative way to achieve different objectives. And so with this question, we were trying to get into that. One thing we did is we randomized the options, and we have found that it actually matters. So people do have a tendency not to look well at the answers. So we randomize and we control for randomization in our analysis. We also asked them to rank the 3 least preferred policies. We then asked them explicitly for validation. We asked them for them to tell us if the information affected their views. We also asked them to tell us if they chose imports as the preferred policy, why they did so, were they worried about China, national security, quality issues, jobs, or some other reasons. We also allowed them to write and tell us explicitly if they were additional concerns. As I mentioned, because we have been running this survey now for 2 years during the pandemic, we also asked them how the pandemic has changed their views on trade, if they have changed the views, if it's related to the movement of people, the imports of medical equipment, the imports in general, and global supply chains. And we also asked them if COVID has affected their views on China. As I mentioned, we have been implementing this survey for 4 years, actually more than 4 years now. We first ran early trials in 2017. I'm going to present you results on Qualtrics, run August 2018, April 2019, June 20, and June 21. In the last 2 rounds, we asked about the Trump tariffs and also the COVID questions. These samples have been stratified by Qualtrics, by gender, age, race, education, and region. In the earlier samples, we also asked a treatment that it's not trade, it's technology, where we shared information of the research done by Daron Acemoglu, that it's robots, the ones that are, if you want, the reason of the loss of jobs. We didn't get a lot of action from that treatment, and so we excluded in later treatments. And so this is just some summary statistics. As I mentioned, our sample is stratified. It represents the US characteristics in terms of gender, age, and also race. In terms of income, close to 60,000, education levels, and employment status. Again, we also try to get sectorial, manufacturing being a little bit less than 10% in the US economy. Then this is just the outcomes in terms of political preferences, trust and beliefs, and also the use of news and location characteristics. And so to go into some of the findings, when we start again by the simple yes, no, and question, and ask participants to express their views on protection, we got close to 57% in the first two rounds, to 18 to 19 of participants to say, yes, I would like to limit imports. The share increased a little bit during COVID and actually stabilized and went down a little bit in the second COVID round. It hasn't gone back to the first round, but again, there was, if you want, an increase, and it's leveling off. When we ask them about tariffs, what is interesting is that the support is lower, close to a quarter. And again, could be that people just don't like the word tariffs, or don't understand the word tariffs, or have a more complex understanding of the relation of prices and quantities. However, as you see, some of the more, or some of the other policy preferences, progressive taxation, minimum wage, actually had higher preferences. And so when we ask participants to rank the preferences, limits on imports is not their top choice, 20%. The top choices tend to be education, taxes, and improving education. And I think this is important because it does matter when you're asking people a simple yes, no, versus when you're asking them to rank the preferences. And we got these very clearly and in every round that we conducted the survey. And so we then look at the different policies against a treatment. The policy variable is a dummy, whether the participant express a positive reaction or preference to the policy in question. And the treatment is a dummy for the different treatments, because this is randomized. The omitted category is the pure control, and the beta allows us to simply read the results as the effect of the treatment. We run this as a logic, but we also did a principal control component. We included all possible controls, the dummy for gender, age, race, where they were born, where they were employed, their household income. Since we have location, we match this information with BIA community characteristics, including the author and co-authors China shock variables. We have prior political preferences, the use of news, as I mentioned, county characteristics, and we also use dummies for weeks in case different things were happening at that time, and that was indeed the case throughout our samples. As I mentioned, we run this as Provit, two-way cluster. We also do a principal component, and we clean in different ways the data. And so when we look at the effects of trade hurts, and so we expose participants to the narrative, trade hurts jobs, we got them to significantly in relation to the no information treatment for them to support more limits and imports. We got them also more likely to support tariffs. They were also, although not significant, less likely to support free trade agreements. And in general, when we asked them to rank most preferred policies, limits on imports also showed up as one of the preferred policies. The principal component summarizes the different variables. And again, we consistently find that when we expose participants to trade hurt jobs, we get them to move to become more protectionist. When we expose participants to trade help create a lot of jobs, we don't get consistent, significant results. I mean, across the different policy variables, we just cannot get participants to significantly move to become more pro-trade or less against protection. This was the case 2018, 2019. It was also the case when we ran this, the COVID 2020 to 21. When we exposed participants to trade hurt jobs, we got them to become consistently, statistically significant, more protectionist. When we told them trade helps jobs, we just don't get them to move in the opposite direction. And we checked if the information treatments were affecting their views. And again, consistently, they told us that it was the case. In terms of the marginal effects, one of the variables that consistently is significant is political affiliation. As we all know, the Republicans have become the party of protection. This is something that has been noted in additional work. We pick it up in our results. And so as a comparison, the trade hurt treatments is similar to 1/3 of the magnitude of being self-identified as a Republican supporter. And so quantitatively is an important effect in terms of becoming more protectionist. Other variables, the literature has found women and race to be more protectionist. We don't find those results. We do find older participants to be more pro-trade. We found if participants were watching for older participants to be less in favor of trade. We found participants who watch Fox News to be against trade. And what is interesting, if they were watching CNN or BBC, because we asked, they would be more pro-trade. And as I mentioned, randomization order matter. Education, we not always found significant results. We also asked them about price treatments, trade helps prices. And here, what is, as I said, a consistent result is we tell them trade lowers prices, and we actually get them to be more against trade. And this was also consistent and different policy variables. So if anything, it's a puzzling result. We tell them trade lowers prices, and we get them to be against trade. Because we were puzzled against by this result. In follow-ups, as I mentioned, we're concerned that people were picking low prices as cheaper or low quality. And so we cleaned some of those words. We changed for availability of goods. It was the same result. What is interesting is every time we mentioned China explicitly, we actually got them to be even more against trade. And so this is something we pick up later when we ask them explicitly why they were going against trade. There seems to be something about China that is moving participants against trade. As mentioned, results we checked, and they're driven by participants who correctly recall the treatments. We also checked, and as I mentioned, around the COVID with proxies for mobility, and also the week of the worst protests of Black Lives Movement, we did seem to get that people were drawing less attention to these topics, and that matter in terms of results. The longer folks stayed with the survey, we would then obtain more of our expected results. So again, there seems something about attention that matters for conveying information. And so in the last part of the survey, we explore mechanisms. And so the way we looked at the different mechanisms is we look at the different explanations that have been advanced. The economic self-interest relates, perhaps, if you want, trade policy variables, your the sector that you represent or the factor that you represent may be affected differently by trade, and that is going to perhaps affect your policy preferences. Think Hexerolin, Viner model, so on and so forth. So we use personal exposure proxies for industry of employment, location, unemployment experience, and education. We also check what Baldwin has called social concerns. And so we look at the views of income inequality and trust. We look at the identity politics, just to see if this is reinforcing prior political positions. And we also look at behavioral loss aversion proxies. Again, we are mindful that many of these proxies are imperfect proxies and may be picking at different characteristics, but still we think it's useful to arrange them under different potential explanations. And so a traditional trade theory would tell us that perhaps workers are worried about the particular exposure of their economic activity to trade, think Stobel-Samuelson. And so we check whether employment in manufacturing matter, and we check whether exposure to the China shock matter. We didn't find significant results. We didn't get, in particular, for the manufacturing folks to be more predisposed when faced with the treatment trade hurts. Similarly, the China shock didn't seem to get a lot of traction. Education also didn't seem to be particularly important in explaining some of the results. We looked at sociotropic concerns, income inequality. We also didn't find significant results when looking at income inequality. Perhaps more interesting, when participants express some higher trust in government, we did seem that they would be less open, they were less protectionist when exposed to the treatments. Perhaps their view is that there's some other variables that are better, that would deal better with the problem, and they trust the government to do so. And indeed, we did find some evidence that these are also the folks that would be more in favor of taxation and education. As mentioned, one variable that has recently been found to explain some of these preferences at a level is political affiliation. But we also find that these folks would be more likely, if you're a Democrat, to be more in favor of trade, and or conversely, a Republican against liberalization. So we did find some action in identity politics. We didn't find a lot of action. We're looking at behavioral variables for jobs, but we did find that behavioral proxies matter when we were asking about prices. So perhaps some loss aversion is explaining the puzzling result that people are worried about these prices, and we did get some action there. As I mentioned, we explicitly went and asked participants to tell us why they were choosing limits on imports. And we consistently found that people were concerned about jobs and China. So there seems to be, again, some general concern about jobs that is being picked up in the treatments, even when we mention the prices are lower, and the concerns about China. The particular case of China is interesting because our theories in general, even when they're dealing with monopolies, they were always thinking about monopolies being a private firm. We don't really have theories that engage trade as competing against the sovereign, and perhaps this is some of the issues that are being latent in the participant concerns when we mention some of our results and treatments. Perhaps just to finish with a more positive note is that when we expose participants to a longer treatment, where we first explained trade hurts, but trade also helps jobs, we actually did find some of the effects to be somewhat mitigated. And this might also speak to these complex topics do require longer engagement than this quick Twitter world in which we're living, but it's just very hard for people to make their attention to these more nuanced and longer explanations about the effects of trade. So let me conclude. I just went a little bit over the time assigned. As I mentioned, we do get, as an information treatment, narratives related to trade hurts to shift policy preferences against protection. The results are not symmetric. We cannot get treatments on trade helps to move participants because we're using this randomization methodology. This allows for interpretation. And the fact that we have been doing this for 4 years and finding somewhat stable results, again, gives some potential, if you want, a leeway in claiming some broader validation. We do draw the attention that attention matters. And so we engage with people longer, or they engage with the survey longer, they did seem to react the way we were thinking. But in terms of underlying mechanism, the trade hurts narratives appears to be reinforcing existing views, concerns about jobs, concerns about China. And of course, for us, if we are teaching trade, it does make us think what is the best way to engage the public. And our results are pessimistic about the world of the quick online communication messaging. So if you're gonna go to a talk show, make time to explain your results, because the 5-minute spiel may not necessarily give you what you were hoping for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. That's fascinating. Well, we're gonna open to Q&A. I'm gonna take advantage of my power right now to make one question, which is, it's very, very puzzling, the price result, as you said. And I wonder if, well, two questions related. Whether is there any demographic that you found, if you've done this analysis, where actually that result is not there? And B, I wonder if the fact that that result is there is because the predominant view is that trade hurts. So people will say, well, you know, we rather pay a higher price to save people's job. And I don't know if there's a way to, with your baseline variables, to get to that.
So, as I mentioned, not all demographics got that result. It's particularly older, if you want, with certain political identities. So gender, we don't find significant results. So it changes. College was not that significant. So it's not obvious where it's there. The one that does seem to get that is unemployed. So unemployed does consistently, we find those results. On the predetermined view that trade is evil, so we had a question on NAFTA and we used that as a benchmark. And it turns out it's not. When you say NAFTA, we were not getting the same results. So people who were against NAFTA were not necessarily more moved when they saw the negative treatment. And we take that as saying it is not per se an underlying view about trade. Our results suggest it is some underlying view about trade with China. And as I said, our trade theories are not about trading with a big sovereign. Even when it's a monopoly, it used to be a private firm. And so again, it is possible that our trade theories just don't have a lot to say about the particular concern that people are expressing. But yes, we did check, and NAFTA gave us some validation. It's not per se being against trade.
Beata, please.
So, Laura, could your results simply reflect low credibility of academic research? So, in other words, people don't believe results of academic papers, but when you draw their attention to trade hurting jobs, you're simply priming them to think about this, and this issue becomes more salient in their minds, and therefore they respond more strongly favoring protectionism.
So it's interesting you asked this. Amit saw our paper, and he told us that his prior was that people wouldn't respond to anything about researchers. So the fact that we even get them to move, even if it's negative, for him was surprising. So it is the case that we do have this asymmetry. They do respond to negative views as opposed to positive, and it could be that it's just latent. And so, as I said, that's why we poked a lot with that NAFTA question is not intrinsic about trade. And so that made us think that there is something that our treatment was bringing up about trade with China. And also there's identity politics. There does seem to be now a group that is more against trade, and everything you mentioned against trade will move them more against trade. So it is particular. So identity politics seem to be, and whatever underlying beliefs, the main mechanism that we found to be significant.
Could it, if I may just add, could it be that, NAFTA seems so long ago, and people just simply don't think much about NAFTA? They are less familiar with it, particularly younger generations. So China is what's on their mind. And by talking about trade hurting jobs, you're simply confirming their priors. And that's why you're getting this asymmetric treatment, because you're confirming what they believe anyway.
So I haven't checked, but you gave me an idea, because it is actually older people who are more against trade. So if this is some view on NAFTA, they grew up with NAFTA. And so we're gonna try some interactions with age just to see if we can get a little bit into this salient.
Let me just go to one question from the audience before, if other of my colleagues have a question, but let me, Swati, hi Swati, she's asking a question. I don't know if we can bring her up, but I'll read it for now. It says, really interesting, why not get enumerators for the service if there is such an inattention problem? I don't know if I don't know if you got this, Laura. I don't know exactly.
I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, I don't know if Swati can come up and ask if that's possible, if that's not going to create a lot of chaos. I don't know if I have the power to do that.
Maybe the idea is that if there was an enumerator reading the question, people would be forced to pay more attention to all the options. I think while they are reading the text online, they just skim through the first few options. I think that may be this.
Yeah, sorry, I can't seem to put on the video, but the audio is on now. So hi, Laura. It's a great paper, really interesting. The main issue is that you seem to have this really big inattention issue, which, of course, always comes up in online surveys, and enumerators would resolve part of that issue. Maybe this is just pure rational inattention coming in.
So we had a company do the survey for us. We do control for attention. So attention does matter. But as I said, our results are not being driven per se by the people who cannot recall the treatment. So at least in terms of people, they knew what they got was there. Staying with it matters. And one way that we made people stay with it a little bit longer is when we did the multiple treatments. We talked to, I have a colleague that has been doing surveys for a long time, and it's complex to ask at the end whether people understood. Like if you're running a test, like a final, like, do you understand? It apparently just participants tend not to like this feeling that you're being asked in a test. So it makes it very hard for us to know who exactly understood or didn't understand. But we have all these proxies, and you're right. It does seem that attention is key. In fact, the way Stefania has been running her experiments is she engages participants with a 45-minute video. And she actually does get that after you engage people with 45-minute video and survey, they walk away feeling better against trade. So what our result does suggest that the way we're doing it, Twitter is not helping. But it's a reality of how information is being given. It's a reality that people are also not spending more than 5 minutes on anything anymore.
That's probably the most encouraging thing you've said, that Twitter is not working.
Well, I'm not a fan of, I have a teenager, so anyone who has teenagers probably doesn't have a good relation with social media, but let's keep it there.
The floor is open for more questions.
Yeah, so maybe I can ask a question. Laura, thanks a lot for this super interesting presentation and paper. Can you say a bit more about the policy implications? I mean, what should policymakers be doing? Should they be doing anything at all? Like, what do you think are the main takeaways here?
So as we said, there is the feature that is salient, and so it is reinforcing pre-existing beliefs. And so one needs to think, if we do believe the facts that we are given are the correct ones, then we do need to start thinking how to engage participants. And it does mean sitting down and trying to explain better. The underlying question that Swati asked is, how do you grab people's attention? But it does seem to be necessary if one does believe that the facts that we're presenting are the correct one, and people need to be convinced about them.
We have two participants that raise their hands. No, it's Catherine and Beata, so they're here. Go ahead, Catherine.
It's very close to what the discussion just was. The questions about prices do you have a sense that if you made them much more salient and said something along the lines of the price of your washing machine is X% lower, it would be a way to sort of tip people into a more positive feeling?
So one of the restrictions we wanted is we did not want to give participants hypothetical. So I don't know if they bought a washing machine, but we did tell them a general line of goods that they were likely to have bought, which were electronics, durables, and apparel. And that didn't do the trick. However, when we told them that Trump tariff increased prices, they did react more positively they react negatively to trade. And again, that it could be that one was just recent or something, but that one didn't get as puzzling results as when we were telling them prices went down. That is where the loss aversion results also made us think that in terms of prices, the loss aversion, and we got that result, matter a little bit more. Clearly, it is not symmetric. And we will see now that inflation is kicking everywhere. People apparently were not as appreciative when prices went down, but now that prices are going up, people are starting to realize that it does matter.
If I may, Laura, so your questions were focused very much on the effects in the US. What if you talked about studies showing that people in developing countries were lifted out of poverty as a result of trade?
So it's interesting. you asked that because some of the first tests we run, we did it in Singapore, as David was in Singapore. And what is interesting is that in Singapore, you could never get people to be against trade. So every time we were exposing people against different treatments, and there we did try treatments against Singapore, we told them about the US, what you would get is people to be against migration. But we never got them to be against trade. So that made us think that it's not so easy then to start conveying external experiences. And so we stayed in the US with the US. Having said that, there is this very nice paper done by the IDB, Ernesto Stein and co-authors. They include a question in the Latin Barometro. And I don't know if you know this, people in Latin America are in favor of trade. So when you compare like the averages, in our case, we get 60% against trade. In Latin America, you get 60% in favor of trade. So there is a context that seems to matter.
If I remember correctly, when my EBRD colleagues used World Values Survey, what they saw is an inverse relationship with GDP. So in rich countries, people are against trade. In poorer countries, people favor trade.
And then middle income countries too, because Latin America is middle income.
Well, so it's, it's sort of, right, depends.
Yeah. So,
right.
but yeah, so.
But middle income, I think most countries are, at least in the sample they used, were in favor of trade.
So that does say that there is a very strong context, and as I say, we tried, and our view was like, well, we're not gonna move people a lot when we talk about the rest of the world. Notice that we were not even moving people a lot when we mentioned income inequality in the US is going up. And this is a result that it's not only us that have found. In general, there's Stefania's work also has found that people don't get moved that much by income inequality. Even theirs, like in their paper, they finally got them to move on taxation after very rounds, but it's not something that gets people to react.
I think we're reaching the end of our seminar. So I'm just gonna take a minute to thank all of you for coming. We have an exciting series ahead. Please visit our website, which hopefully somebody can copy paste in the chat, but if not, Google it, Policy Implications of Recent Globalization Research. We have a great lineup for the rest of the semester. And thank you, Laura, this was fascinating, and we're gonna be in the lookout for how this research evolves. And if you want to stick around for a few minutes with the panelists, we can do that. Thank you
very much for the comments.
I think we probably can stop the recording. Yes.
Now we are offline, so I think we are not broadcasting and recording. So
yeah, so there is a part of salient that does seem to be part of the story. Again, it's Republicans that get moved and Democrats that get moved. Like there is, and we checked with the NAFTA.